Hey guys, it's Danica. I'm in the home that I'm flipping. As you can see, there's a lot of progress going on behind me, but today I want to talk to you about floors. The floors that I am sanding are oak, and I'm going to go through the tips and tricks of how I was able to sand the entire thing down, and I'm actually going to leave them raw and no stain. So I originally rented a big orbital sander, and I used a 60 grit, and it did absolutely nothing. Wah, wah. It basically just buffed the floor. I'm refinishing oak, and now that I've been reading up on it, it's actually one of the hardest floors to refinish. So don't think for a second that you won't need the belt sander, because you do. I got home with the push-orbital, and after 2 hours of getting nowhere, I took it right back and swapped it out for the belt sander. This just up, and your belt on like this. Bring it to the edge. That's it. No clip in. Pull this down. You're good to go. Although I like to leave this up, it was a bit more dusty. By leaving the belt up, I was able to see the three main areas that I was getting to. So I knew if this is what I wanted. When this is down, you can't really see where your belt is. So for the end, I like to leave this up. Switch on, it'll automatically go back to the middle and then off. And this here is key and super important, and they all do have this. This allows the belt to touch the floor. Do not turn your belt on with this down, or you will carve out your floor. Make sure this is locked. Once it's started, then slowly lower this and start pushing. I started with a 36 grit, and it was an intense difference from the orbital. This first stroke is a 36 grit. Crazy, because this first stroke is with the orbital, this is with the belt. It definitely has a lot more power and pulls you, but that's what you want. If you have never used a belt sander before, put on a super high grit. A high grit sandpaper basically means it's less invasive. The lower the grit, the harder it is, and the more it will take off of your floor. So if you are able to do a test patch with like a 120 or a 150, you can understand what it feels like to maneuver the push sander, because if you practice with an 80 or a 60, you'll eat your floor apart. The key to using it is not to let it sit in the same spot, or it will keep digging out your floor. It has no chill. You also need to sand in the direction of the grain. That's what we're taught. However, like I said before, I really like the look of darker grooves, marks in the floor, clear sanding, and saw marks, sort of like the way they're making vinyl now. Matte finish, but rustic. With your first grit, I use a 36. Just do straight passes with a slow walk and be mindful of how your floor looks. I tried to push my sandpaper to the limit, and I just ended up wasting time, going over spots multiple times. Don't do this, and just put a new one on for the sake of $5. After a 36 grit, I went right to a 60. With the 36, you take off a lot of the finish and some of the color, but the floors and subfloors have settled in most cases, and there will be slightly high points, and that's what you're taking down for the first round. You'll see this in a lot of places in the flooring where you might have one plank of floor and half of it was sanded and the other half wasn't. It feels level to you, but technically it's not. Once I did the entire floor with the 36, I put on the 60. And the 60 grit is actually my favorite for floors. It took enough off, but it didn't leave any burns. When I switched to the 80 and higher, that's when I found that the floor was sensitive to marking up and burning. You're not actually burning it, but you are creating burn marks. I had about 600 square feet to do, and it took me 2 full days to get the entire floor to an 80 grit. The only thing about this sander is it's going to leave you an edge right around here, because you clearly can't get in all the way. Get as close as possible to it, because the edger was actually a lot harder to use. For me anyway, it has so much power and it completely takes off. You also have to use it bent over, so it's a lot harder to use. There's no push option for it where you're standing and you can be ergonomically correct. Try and get as much off with the belt first and save your back when you use the edger. I didn't film much of the edging process, but basically you just run it along the wall and it gets in super close. I started with 60 right away. I could have even done an 80, as this is the most intense sander that I have ever used. The grit you start with doesn't really matter as long as you end up with the same grit you did the rest of the floor on. You sanded the rest of your floor to 120, sand your edges to a 120. Now that you have belted everything and edged everything, you are almost done. The edger was hard to use, so I ended up burning a lot of the floor. So that's when I put a 60 on my orbital, and it takes the burns out pretty quickly. Don't be alarmed when you do see some of these burn marks happening. Usually it's because your sandpaper is dull, so swap that out and just keep going. Your orbital will take it out. I actually left a few of the burns though. I did like some of them. Same with the scuffs for moving my belt sander against the grain. This is taught to be a huge no-no. But if you want to have floors that have a bit more character, I say go for it. I would just only do it at the end of the process when you're more comfortable with using the tool. Once you leave and you're finished and the dust settles, spots like this is how to tell if you are staining your floor. You cannot leave this white part here. This long strip here has to be sanded off. Even these little guys here. If you're going to be staining like a natural stain, that would probably be fine. But if you're going dark, that will not hold color. So you really need to get in with your orbital sander and do all of these pieces up to the same grit. So as you can see, I have all of those little white spots there to grab that I have to get again. Okay, now you're ready to finish it. I wanted to keep the marks. I liked how raw it was, but if you don't and you do want to stain it, now is when the first orbital push sander would come in handy, because you can simply get into the walls right up to where the baseboard will be without an edger, and you can sand up to 300 grit if you wanted to. This all depends on the desired look of the floors you want at the end. I wanted a raw matte vinyl look, but if you are going with a darker stain, make sure to bring the push orbital sander back into your home at the end. You do want to make sure that your entire floor is sanded to a higher grit when you are staining. Don't ignore the process. It goes belt sander, then your edger, then your orbital handheld to take out the burns, and then the push orbital to polish all the way up to your desired grit. Once I was able to take the burns out that I wanted to, I swept, I vacuumed, and then when the dust settled, I used a tack cloth to get the rest of the dust up, the finer dust that you can't see. I taped it off in sections, but I quickly realized that this is the easiest part, and it's not too overwhelming to do it all at once. Just don't back yourself into a corner that you can't walk out of. I poured it on, and I used this cool $12 finishing tool on the end of my broomstick and applied a clear coat on all of it. I used a matte finish. Matte plus the random imperfections and sanding marks was the look I really wanted to achieve. Absolutely in love with how it turned out. Just like that, 4 days later, the entire project was done. But like most projects, halfway through, I thought, why did I do this? Then at the end, my thought process changed, like it normally does. And yes, I would do it again. I would just follow my own advice, going belt sander, edger, and then orbital. Then I'm not running back and forth 100 times, and I know exactly how to do it. So hopefully this is like your first time and you won't make the same mistakes I did. Happy DIYing. Let me know what you thought about it, if you've done your own floors, or if you have any tips or tricks for me to learn for the next time I do them, because I'm pretty sure I'll find hardwood in another flip somewhere along the road.